I don't camp much anymore. It's not that I hate the woods or being outside. I used to love that part of it, the trees, the clean air, the quiet. But ever since one trip a couple years back, something changed in me. That trip gave me something I still can't shake. And no matter how much time has passed, the dreams keep showing up. They don't let me forget. I've tried to move on, tried to bury the memories under everyday routine. But they come back every few nights, and I wake up sweating through my sheets, heart racing, teeth clenched. That one camping trip is stuck in my head like a splinter I can't dig out. It was supposed to be a solo trip. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people, from the buzz of town, from everything that was starting to weigh me down. I figured a few nights out in nature would reset my head a bit. I'd done solo camping before. I knew what I was doing. I knew how to pack light, how to set up camp, how to keep myself safe. I planned a 4-day trip in early October, just when the weather cools off and the trails get less crowded. I picked a spot a few hours north of where I live, deep into a stretch of state forest I hadn't explored much before. I looked at satellite maps and topographical charts, cross-referenced with trail guides. I found a flat area near a bend in a creek, far off the marked trails. No campsites, no road access, no cell signal. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove up early on a Friday, parked on a side pull-off near an old service road, and hiked in from there. It was about 7 miles from the car to where I planned to set up camp. The hike took most of the day since I stopped a few times to rest and look around. I didn't see another person the whole way in. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet where you start hearing your own footsteps echoing in your ears. The trees were turning gold and red, leaves crunched underfoot. It was peaceful in the way only the middle of nowhere can be. I got to the creek bend a little after 3 in the afternoon and started setting up camp. I pitched my tent on a flat patch of pine needles, strung a line between 2 trees for drying clothes, and set a small fire pit with a circle of rocks. I had enough food packed for 4 days, a good water filter, and layers to keep warm at night. Everything seemed in order. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, cooked some freeze-dried stew, and read a paperback by headlamp until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I heard owls calling in the distance, and at one point I thought I heard something move through the brush not far from camp. But it didn't seem close, and I didn't think much of it. Animals move around at night. That's just how it is. I slept fine the first night. The second day was cloudy but still mild. I spent most of it hiking the nearby area, following the creek upstream for a couple of miles. It wound through a narrow cut of land between 2 rises, lined with mossy boulders and slippery stones. I saw a few deer and found a spot where something, probably a raccoon, had been digging in the mud. Around mid-afternoon, I headed back to camp to cook dinner before it got dark. The strange looking back now, how normal everything felt up to that point. There were no signs, no warnings, nothing felt off. That night is when things changed. It started with the sounds. I had just put out the fire and crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard something in the woods. It wasn't loud. At first, it sounded like twigs snapping, like something light stepping through the brush. I figured maybe it was a deer or a fox, but it kept going. Slow steps, stopping every few seconds. The sound circled around my camp, keeping its distance but never really leaving. It was hard to tell exactly where it was. Sound plays tricks on you out there. The woods can make something close seem far, and something far seem close. I lay there listening for maybe 20 minutes, trying to stay calm, trying to tell myself it was just a curious animal. But then the sound stopped, dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I waited, barely breathing, heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it again, closer. It sounded like something heavy brushing against a tree, maybe 30 or 40 feet from my tent. It was subtle, but it wasn't nothing. It made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. My mind started racing, jumping through every possibility. Bear? I didn't think so. I hadn't seen signs. No scat, no claw marks. Maybe a coyote? But they didn't usually come alone. And this didn't move like a coyote. Then I heard breathing. It was faint, like someone just on the edge of whispering. A slow, steady inhale and exhale, not far from the tent wall. My stomach tightened. My first instinct was to grab my knife, which was zipped inside the side pocket of my bag. I reached slowly and pulled it out. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just lay there, knife in hand, listening. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then finally it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I lay awake, frozen, ears tuned to every creak and crack outside. I kept the knife in my hand until the sky turned light again. When the sun came up, I got out of the tent slowly and looked around the campsite. I didn't see anything at first. No tracks, no signs of disturbance. But when I walked around the side of the tent toward the tree line, I saw something that made me go cold. There were claw marks on the bark of a tree, long, fresh ones, about chest high, for deep grooves dragged downward through the wood. Whatever had made them had been big, bigger than anything I'd expected out there. The spacing between the marks was wide. That wasn't a raccoon. That wasn't a bobcat. I looked around the area again, this time more carefully. About 10 feet from the tree, the ground was disturbed, like something heavy had stood there and shifted its weight. The pine needles were compressed into the dirt, and in a few spots, I could see faint impressions of what might have been tracks. They were hard to make out, but they didn't look like hooves. They were broad, with clear toe shapes, almost like a human's foot but wider, thicker. My hands were shaking by the time I walked back to camp. I made a decision right then. I was going to pack up and leave. I'd been in enough wild areas to know when I didn't belong, and that spot suddenly felt like a bad place to stay. I started breaking down the tent, rolling up my bag, stuffing gear into my pack. I worked fast but kept stopping to look over my shoulder. Every sound in the trees made me twitch. Just as I was about to collapse the tent, I heard something again, low, rumbling, like a growl far off in the trees. Not loud, but deep. My chest clenched. I didn't wait to hear more. I grabbed the rest of my gear, stuffed the tent half folded into my pack, and started hiking back toward the car. The hike out was the longest 7 miles I've ever walked. I moved fast, barely stopping, heart hammering the whole way. I kept looking back, scanning the trees, listening for anything that followed. I don't know if it did. I never saw anything, but the feeling of being watched never left. I didn't relax until I was in the car with the doors locked and the windows rolled up. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the breathing, the marks on the tree, the way the woods had gone dead silent. I kept thinking about those faint tracks. I didn't tell anyone right away. I figured no one would believe me. I didn't really believe myself. I kept going over it again and again, trying to make sense of it. The dreams started a few nights later. At first, they were vague, just dark woods and the sound of twigs breaking underfoot. But over time, they got worse. I'd dream I was in the tent again, hearing something circle me, then feeling the breath of it on the thin nylon wall. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding so hard it felt like my chest would crack. Some nights I'd dream I was running through the woods, stumbling, falling, something chasing me. I never saw it, but I could hear it getting closer, hear it breathing behind me. The worst part is the way I'd wake up, usually sitting upright, gasping, the echo of that growl still ringing in my ears. Months passed. The dreams didn't stop. I tried therapy, tried sleep aids, even stopped watching anything stressful before bed. None of it helped. Every few nights, the nightmare came back. It's like part of my brain stayed behind in those woods and can't find its way home. Now, even walking near dense woods makes me uneasy. I start sweating. My muscles lock up. I can't go camping anymore. I sold most of my gear. The tent, the stove, even the boots. I gave away the pack. I stopped going on hikes. I avoid trailheads. I keep the windows locked at night and triple-check the door. Sometimes I wonder if it really was just a bear or some strange animal passing through. But the way it moved, the feeling it left behind, it wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, like it saw me, like it knew I was there and wanted me to know it too. I think it could have done something that night, but it didn't. It wanted me to leave, and I did. I just wish it had let me forget. I had been camping for years by the time I decided to try something a little more remote. I was used to the typical state park campgrounds. lakeside spots with picnic tables, fire pits, and bathrooms just a short walk away. But something about those sites had started to feel a little too polished. I wanted to get further out, away from all the noise and artificial comfort. So I picked a national forest in a part of the state I'd never been to before. Thick woods, winding gravel roads, and no cell service for miles. I had about a 4-hour drive that Friday morning. I packed the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water jugs, propane stove, headlamp, first aid kit, and my mess kit. That last part is something I take care of pretty seriously. I've had the same aluminum mess kit for over 10 years. The thing's beat up, scratched, a little dented, but it still works like a charm. It's got a pot with a lid that doubles as a frying pan, a small bowl, and a plastic cup that folds into itself. I clean it obsessively every time I use it. I don't even let it get wet in my pack. I wrap it in a garbage bag and cinch it tight with a bungee cord. So what happened that weekend didn't just surprise me, it disturbed me. The campsite wasn't marked, just a flat clearing about 30 yards from a quiet creek. It took me a while to find it because the turnoff from the main gravel road was almost invisible. It looked more like a trail than a road, barely wide enough for my truck. The only way I even spotted it was because someone had tied a strip of orange flagging tape to a branch about 7 feet off the ground. I figured another camper had done it as a marker. The forest was thick, mostly pines and maples, with a few white birch scattered here and there. It was early fall. The nights were getting cold, but the days were still warm enough to hike without a jacket. I parked in the clearing and took a quick walk around the perimeter. There were no signs of trash, no old fire pits, no beer cans or candy wrappers. That's always a good sign. I walked down to the creek and found a nice little bend where the water got deep enough to wash up and fill a pot for boiling. The air smelled clean, like cold moss and pine sap. I felt good about the spot. It was far enough away from any roads or towns that I wouldn't have to worry about people stumbling in during the night. I set up the tent just before sunset and got a small fire going with some twigs and dry bark. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple dinner, rice and canned chili, boiled some creek water, and washed the pot out with sand and hot water. Then I scrubbed everything again with biodegradable soap, dried it completely, and packed it all back in the mess kit. As always, I wrapped the whole kit in a plastic bag, twisted it shut, and tied it tight. I even wedged it inside my empty cooler, which I latched closed. Not bear-proof, I know, but better than leaving it out in the open. Then I laid down in my tent and fell asleep listening to the wind move through the trees. I woke up the next morning around 7. It was cold. My breath fogged up in front of me. I walked to the creek and splashed cold water on my face to wake up. I hadn't seen any signs of animals during the night. No raccoons, no deer. Just a few birds hopping around the branches above. I felt rested and calm. I brewed some coffee in my little camp kettle and sat on a log sipping it while watching the sunlight move through the woods. It was one of those mornings where everything feels quiet in a good way. Still, balanced. Around 10, I decided to go for a hike. I packed a small day pack with water, snacks, my knife, and a compass. I left everything else at camp. The fire pit had cooled off, so I kicked some dirt over the ashes just to be safe. I was gone for about 5 hours, bushwhacking through some of the steepest terrain I've ever been on. When I got back, I was sore, hungry, and ready to eat something hot. I grabbed the cooler to take out the mess kit, and the second I opened it, I knew something was wrong. First, there was a weird smell. Not just musty or damp, something else. A sharp, sour smell, almost like spoiled milk but heavier, thicker. I pulled out the plastic-wrapped bundle and the bag was wet. That made no sense. I'd wrapped it bone dry, double-checked it the night before. I tore the plastic open and immediately stepped back. My stomach dropped. Inside the mess kit were 2 drowned mice. They were packed into the pot, tangled together like they'd been thrown in and couldn't escape. Their fur was soaked, their tiny feet stretched stiff. Their eyes were half open. The water in the pot was cloudy and smelled rancid, like decay and grease and something else I couldn't place. It didn't make sense. I never left food out. I didn't leave the pot open. I didn't even leave crumbs. The mess kit had been sealed and wrapped and closed in a latched cooler. And even if mice had somehow chewed their way in, which they didn't because there were no holes in the plastic, they'd still have to crawl into the pot, die in it, and somehow fill it with water. I dumped the mess kit out behind a fallen log and used a stick to push the mice into a hole in the ground. I didn't want to touch them. The water smelled so bad I almost threw up. I poured what was left far from camp and washed the whole kit in the creek with hot water, sand, and soap. Then I boiled the pot 3 times over the fire just to be safe. But the image of those mice stuck with me. I kept thinking about it. The water, the way their bodies were positioned, like they'd been thrown in and not crawled in. That night I couldn't sleep well. Every little sound had me awake, listening. I thought maybe an animal got into my camp while I was hiking. But how would that explain the water? There hadn't been any rain. My tarp was still dry. My tent, my gear, everything was dry. Only the inside of the mess kit was wet. It didn't make sense. The next day I stayed close to camp. I didn't want to hike out just yet, but I also didn't want to wander too far. I kept feeling like something had been through my things while I was gone. I checked all my gear again. Nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Mid-afternoon, I walked down to the creek again to fill up some more water and noticed something else that didn't sit right. There were small prints in the mud just upstream from where I usually filled my pot. Tiny, 5-toed prints. Not raccoon, smaller than that. I thought maybe squirrel, but squirrels don't usually get that close to water. The prints were fresh, too. Sharp edges, no rain to wash them out. And there were a lot of them, like something had been pacing there. I walked back to camp and sat for a while just staring at the trees. That evening I ate a granola bar and a few strips of jerky, not wanting to use the pot again even though I'd cleaned it. Something about it still felt wrong. I put the mess kit away like before, clean, dry, wrapped and sealed in the cooler. But I didn't sleep well again that night. I kept hearing tiny noises outside the tent. Nothing big, just little rustles, like small feet in dry leaves. I told myself it was mice, maybe squirrels, but it felt coordinated somehow, like it wasn't just one animal but several, creeping quietly around my camp. I sat up most of the night with my knife in my hand, listening. When the sun came up, I was already packing. I didn't even make coffee. I broke down camp in silence, loaded everything into the truck, and drove out without eating breakfast. I stopped at a gas station about an hour outside the forest and opened the cooler one more time before tossing it in the trash. The mess kit was wet again. No smell this time, but wet. A thin layer of dirty water at the bottom of the pot, even though I hadn't used it the night before and had made sure it was dry before wrapping it. I didn't try to understand it. I just dropped the whole thing in the dumpster and drove home. I haven't camped since. Not deep woods, anyway. I stick to places with other people around. Places with cell service and trail cameras and rangers nearby. I still think about that weekend. I still try to come up with some rational explanation. Maybe condensation. Maybe the cooler leaked. Maybe mice did crawl in somehow. But I've seen a lot of things in the woods over the years, and nothing else ever left me with that same quiet, creeping feeling that something had gotten inside my gear. Not by accident, but on purpose. It wasn't the drowned mice that stuck with me the most. It was the water, the way it kept coming back, even when I was sure everything was sealed and dry. The way it carried that smell, the way those little bodies had looked, twisted together, floating in silence like something had put them there just to let me know I wasn't alone. I'd been planning that solo camping trip for months. Life had felt loud and cluttered, and I needed space to breathe. Not a weekend at some crowded campground with RVs stacked like boxes, but real silence. Deep woods, fresh water, no cell reception. I settled on a small lake in a remote section of forest I had heard about from an old coworker. It didn't show up on many maps, but a few hiking threads had mentioned it. Tucked far off a forest road, then another couple miles in on foot. No official name. Some people called it Birch Lake. The remoteness sold me on it. That and the promise of no one else around. I left my truck hidden just off the last serviceable stretch of road and hiked the 2 miles in. The trail was thin and overgrown in parts, clearly not used much. There were fallen branches, sections of swampy ground I had to carefully cross on logs or rocks. and places where deer paths tangled with the trail, confusing the direction. I took my time, stopping every so often to listen. It was quiet, not dead quiet. The woods never are, but peaceful. Birds, rustling squirrels, an occasional crack of a tree settling. I liked that. Real silence isn't about absence. It's about the absence of people. I reached the lake around late afternoon. It was exactly what I was hoping for. Glassy, still water with dense trees ringing the edges. The far shore had a steep rise covered in firs, casting a shadow across the lake. My side had a flat patch with a mixture of hardwoods and some soft grass. That's where I set up. Tent, small fire pit, logs dragged together for a makeshift bench. I didn't see a single soul all day. Didn't hear any voices, dogs, cars, or anything human. I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. I cooked a small dinner on my camp stove, nothing fancy. Instant rice and a pouch of tuna. Then I sat back and watched the sky turn orange behind the trees. The water reflected every shade, every movement. It was the most peace I'd felt in years. Right before dark, I saw it. I'd been standing at the water's edge brushing my teeth, eyes on the lake. I noticed something about 100 feet out from the shore, slow and low. At first I thought it was a log drifting, but it was moving at a steady pace against the gentle ripple of the lake. Then I saw the ears, the head. It was a bear, a large black bear, swimming directly away from my shore, headed across the lake toward the far side. Something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't that a bear was there. I know bears can swim, and I know they'll do it for food or travel. But what stuck with me was the direction. It was leaving the shore, my shore, as if it had been here already, maybe had been watching me or sniffing around while I was setting up or cooking. And I hadn't noticed a thing. I don't know how long it had been there before I saw it swimming away. That fact sunk a little pit into my stomach. I watched it move across the water until it disappeared into the shadows under the trees on the far side. I went back to camp and double-checked everything. Made sure all my food was sealed up and packed away in the bear canister. Set a good distance from my tent. Cleaned up everything that might have a scent. I even moved the canister farther away than I normally would, just in case. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up to little noises, a stick breaking, a bird fluttering. My mind was alert and jumpy. I knew a bear had been close, and I couldn't stop thinking about what it had been doing near camp. Just curious? Just passing through? At some point in the night, I finally dozed off for a longer stretch and woke up again when it was light enough to see. I got up, stretched, and started walking the edge of the lake, just to see if I could find any tracks. Sure enough, maybe 20 yards from my tent, I found paw prints in the soft mud. Big, deep ones. It had definitely come close. One set led to the water. It had entered there, maybe the same place I had seen it swim from. I followed the prints back a bit, and they zigzagged toward my camp, right up to where I'd been cooking, even toward the logs I'd dragged together to sit on. That was the part that made my chest feel tight. It had been close. It might have been watching me while I cooked, just out of sight behind the trees. I decided to stay another night, but to be more cautious. I moved my tent farther from the main clearing, tucked it closer to a thick patch of trees that backed into a rocky incline. Felt safer there. I built a smaller fire. I didn't cook anything hot. I stuck to granola and jerky. I didn't want any more scents drifting out. I even considered heading back early, but part of me didn't want to give in to nerves. I was in their home and I was being careful. That should be enough. That afternoon passed slowly. The woods were a little quieter. I kept turning at every little noise. It was hard to relax. I fished a bit at the shore but caught nothing. The lake was still and cold, and the air started to drop in temperature early. I decided to turn in just after sundown. Sometime in the night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood feel like ice. It was a splash, not a light one like a fish jumping, a big, heavy one, followed by another, like something large entering the water or moving through it. I sat up in my sleeping bag and held still. My tent was quiet, the air still, but I could hear it faintly. A slosh, a churn, something moving through water. I slowly unzipped the side of my tent and peeked out through the mesh. Couldn't see much. The moon was behind clouds, and the fire had burned out hours ago. I waited. The sound continued. It was deliberate, not flailing, not casual. Something big was moving in the water again. I stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes, trying to figure out what I was hearing. Then it stopped. Dead quiet. Nothing but my breathing. I backed away from the tent flap and just sat there, listening. I don't know how long I stayed awake, but it was well past dawn when I finally crawled out. I went straight down to the lake. There were new prints in the mud, bigger, deeper than the ones before, and they came out of the water this time. They led up past the shoreline toward the edge of where my old fire ring was. Then they circled. I followed them, careful not to step in them, and saw that they had gone right by the path I'd taken when I went to hang the bear canister. They passed by the tree I'd used, then doubled back. It was like the bear had been looking, not just sniffing randomly, but checking places it had smelled something before. That was the part that rattled me. It wasn't just curious anymore. It was investigating, maybe even remembering. That was enough for me. I packed up everything fast and didn't eat anything. I just shoved gear into my pack, unstrapped the tent poles as quick as I could, and got moving. I didn't take breaks. The whole hike back to the truck, I kept checking over my shoulder. Every tree root made me trip. Every squirrel made me jump. My legs burned by the end of it, but I didn't stop. When I got back to the truck, I threw everything in the back, peeled off my pack, and just sat there for a minute with the doors locked. It wasn't fear of bears exactly. I know they don't stalk people like predators, but something about how deliberate it had felt, how close it had gotten without me noticing, how it came back and retraced paths. It didn't feel right. Back at home, I went over everything again in my head. The timing, the prints, the noise in the water. I looked up bear behavior, trying to make sense of it. Some people said bears will return to places where they find food. That matched what I saw. But the swimming, leaving one night and coming back the next, that seemed unusual. Not impossible, but rare. Weeks later, I was still thinking about it. Every night when the wind hit my house just right, I'd hear that water sloshing in my head. Every walk in the woods near home, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder more than I used to. I don't tell people the story to scare them off the woods. Bears aren't monsters. They're smart and careful, and most don't want anything to do with us. But the part that sticks with me, the part that still gives me pause when I step into the trees alone, is how quiet it had all been. How close it had gotten without a sound. How something so big could come right up to me twice, and I never even knew until it was already gone. It reminded me of one simple truth the woods don't let you forget. Out there, you're never really alone. Not even when you think you are. I spent a good portion of my adult life chasing quiet. Real quiet. The kind of silence you can only find when you're far away from anything built by people. No power lines, no sirens, no late-night neighbors shouting in the hall. Just dirt, trees, wind, and the sound of your own breath. That's what drew me to the Appalachian Trail. I had done sections before, little week-long hikes, a few weekends here and there, but this time I decided to go further. I planned to hike about 300 miles from northern Georgia up through North Carolina, dipping into Tennessee. It was a late spring start, early enough to miss the bulk of the summer hikers, but warm enough that the days were long and the weather was mostly steady. I packed light but smart. Basic gear, tent, bag, food for a week at a time. A little gas stove, some freeze-dried stuff. I had trained for it. I had the maps. I had a plan. The first week was uneventful in the best way. I passed a few hikers here and there, most of them heading south. We didn't talk much, just a nod or a short wave. People on that trail get used to solitude. Most prefer it. The nights were colder than I expected, and the trees hadn't filled in yet, but the trail was dry and the campsites were clean. No issues, no drama. But as I pushed further north, I started hearing stories. Most nights, I'd camp alone, but every few nights, I'd stay near a shelter or meet other hikers at a common clearing. Nobody ever gathered in big groups, but now and then 2 or 3 of us would end up cooking near the same fire. That's when the stories started coming up. Not ghost stories, not the usual urban legend kind of thing. These were different, quieter, shared in low voices, like the people telling them weren't sure they even believed it themselves. The first came from a guy I met just north of Westerwald. He was older, probably in his 60s, strong build, quiet. We didn't talk much. We didn't even sit close to each other. But before bed, he mentioned something strange about the last ridge. Said he felt like someone had been following him. Not close, just always out of sight. Whenever he stopped to listen, it went quiet. But when he started walking again, he'd hear faint steps behind him. He shrugged it off, said it was probably an animal, but it made him uneasy enough that he'd cut his hike short the next day. A few days later, I met another hiker at a water source off the trail. She said she'd been night hiking a bit to beat the heat and claimed she saw someone crouching off the path. Not moving, just watching. She said they didn't speak or approach, just squatted there, half in the brush, maybe 20 feet away, staring. When she turned her light on them, they disappeared behind a boulder. She couldn't find any tracks. She didn't sleep that night. I didn't think too much of it at first. Sleep deprivation, isolation, nerves, those things mess with your head out here. I've had my own moments over the years, especially after a long day when your brain's running on fumes. But the stories didn't stop. About 2 weeks into my hike, I set up camp just off the trail near a spot called Cold Spring. It was quiet, no one else nearby, and the air had that heavy stillness that comes before a storm. I made a quick dinner, drank from my filtered bottle, and settled in early. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of something moving just outside my tent. It wasn't loud, just slow, deliberate steps in the leaves. Then a pause, then another step. I froze. I stayed as still as I could, listening. It circled halfway around the tent and stopped. I didn't breathe. I didn't make a sound. After maybe a minute or two, I heard the steps fade away. Not fast, just slow and steady, back into the trees. In the morning, I checked for prints, but the ground was too dry. Nothing stuck. I tried to tell myself it was a deer, maybe a bear, though they usually make more noise. But something about the way it moved, it just didn't feel like an animal. Felt cautious, like someone trying not to be heard. After that, I started paying closer attention. I noticed more odd things. Rocks stacked near trail junctions. Not the usual cairns hikers leave, but just 2 or 3 rocks balanced in strange places where no one would need a marker. A pile of sticks shaped into a triangle near my tent one morning. Could have been kids messing around. Sure. But I was miles from anything and hadn't seen a soul in 3 days. Then came the night that changed everything. It was near Max Patch, one of those big bald mountains where the trees open up and the views stretch for miles. I was camping in a patch of brush just below the bald, tucked in for wind protection. I was alone. The sun had gone down behind the mountains, and the sky was fading fast. I ate cold food to avoid lighting the stove. Just wanted a quiet night. I had that knot in my gut again, that weird tension I couldn't explain. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly, not to a sound, but to silence. Total silence. No wind, no bugs, no rustling trees, just stillness. Then I heard the breathing. It was low and shallow, not far from the tent. It wasn't mine. I held my breath and listened. It was slow, like someone crouched low to the ground, trying to stay hidden. I reached for the knife I kept next to me, slid it slowly from the sheath. My heart was hammering in my ears. Then the zipper moved. Not fast, not tearing or yanking, just the faintest sound of nylon shifting. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or someone brushing the tent, but I was sure, absolutely sure, someone was outside, inches from me. I didn't move. I just stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Eventually, the sound faded. The breathing stopped. The silence came back, thick and heavy. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. Nothing was disturbed. No tracks, no broken branches. But about 30 yards away, near a stand of trees, there was a circle of small stones, perfectly round. In the center, a flat rock with something carved into it. Not letters, just lines, shapes, nothing I recognized. I packed fast. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. I hiked nearly 20 miles that day, barely stopping. I pushed through muscle cramps and a pulled knee just to get away from that spot. At the next shelter, I met a young guy who'd been through hiking since early March. He looked worn out, like the trail had drained something from him. I didn't tell him what happened to me, but I asked if he'd seen anything strange. He nodded, said a few nights earlier he saw a light in the woods. Not a headlamp, not a fire, just a white light, steady and low, moving through the trees at chest height. He said it moved in a straight line for about 30 seconds, then disappeared. He hiked through the night to get away from it. The pattern was too much to ignore. Different hikers, different stories, same region. Something or someone was in those woods. Not a ghost, not a monster. Something real, something human maybe, or close enough to it. By the time I finished that leg of the trail, I was a different person. I wasn't scared exactly, not in the way people get scared by movies or dark rooms. It was deeper than that, a kind of permanent awareness, like I'd been let in on a truth I didn't want. The wilderness isn't empty, it's full of things that don't want to be seen. That watch from just out of reach. Back home, I kept checking forums, trail reports, Reddit threads. Every now and then I'd find something, post about weird noises near Roan Mountain, a story of a missing solo hiker with no gear found. One guy said he saw a man in a ghillie suit standing perfectly still behind a tree for over an hour, just watching. The stories were always vague, no proof, just enough to make you wonder. I never went back to that section of trail. I still hike, but not like before. I stay closer to roads, to people. I camp near groups. I carry more than a knife now, a GPS tracker, a whistle, a small can of spray. I don't care if it makes me look paranoid, because I know what's out there. Not creatures, not shadows, people, or things pretending to be people. And the scariest part? They're not there to scare you. They don't jump out or chase you. They just watch, wait, get close enough to let you know they're real, then vanish again. Like they're playing a game only they understand. And once you've seen them, really seen them, you never hike the same way again. It was late September when I went out to the woods in northern Michigan. The leaves had just started to change, and the air had that mix of warm sun and cold wind that made you feel like fall was settling in for good. I had rented a small cabin deep in the Manistee National Forest, about 45 minutes from the nearest town. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to feel cut off from the usual noise of everyday life, the constant digital buzz, the hum of people and traffic and pressure. The cabin was basic. One room, a small bed with a heavy wool blanket, a little kitchen with a propane stove, and an outhouse about 30 yards away, half hidden in the trees. No running water, no power, no reception, just how I wanted it. The road to get there wasn't even paved for the last few miles. My truck bounced along the narrow trail, branches brushing the side mirrors. When I finally arrived, I stepped out and just stood still for a few minutes. The silence was almost complete. No cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the pines and the sound of leaves shifting on the forest floor. Felt good, clean. The first 2 days were simple. I chopped some wood, cooked over the fire pit out front, and spent most of the daylight hours walking the trails around the area. I had a paper map I brought with me, marked up with pencil from the ranger's office weeks earlier. I didn't see anyone else, not even in the distance. I thought maybe there would be a hunter or two this deep into the season, but it seemed like I had the entire forest to myself. That third night is when I started noticing the sounds. It was about 9 or 10 when I crawled into bed. The nights were cold enough now that I needed to layer up before getting under the blanket. The fire outside had burned down, and I didn't bother stoking it. I left the lantern by the window. It was one of those battery-powered ones that put out a weak yellow glow, just enough to see where you were stepping inside. I closed my eyes and let my body start to sink into the kind of sleep you only get after hiking 10 miles and carrying firewood on your back. But a little while after I lay down, I heard a sound. It was faint, but it stood out in the stillness. It was like a foot dragging across leaves, not a squirrel darting or a raccoon rummaging. This had weight behind it. I opened my eyes, but didn't move. I stared at the ceiling and waited. Nothing. Then again the sound closer. This time it had more shape. A kind of deliberate crunch, like someone stepping carefully but not perfectly quiet. I sat up and grabbed the flashlight from beside the bed. I held my breath and waited again. When I flicked the light on and pointed it at the window, all I could see was the reflection of the inside. The glare off the glass made it hard to see anything beyond it. I stood up, slowly, and moved to the door. I unlatched it, then pulled it open as quietly as I could and stepped out onto the front porch. The cold bit through my long johns and flannel, and my breath clouded in front of me. I swept the flashlight back and forth across the trees and the clearing around the cabin. Nothing, just darkness and branches swaying in the breeze. The woods looked normal, but the normal looked thinner somehow, the shadows more defined. It was probably just the flashlight playing tricks on my eyes. I told myself that and went back inside. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. I walked the perimeter slow, looking for prints or anything unusual. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, and nothing stood out at first. But along the far edge of the clearing, past the outhouse, I saw something odd. There was a patch of ground that looked like it had been disturbed. The leaves were scattered and pushed aside in a sort of rough arc, maybe a foot wide, like something had swept or dragged through it. No tracks, no paw prints, just that strange sweep. I stayed out on the trails most of the day. I went further than usual, trying to let the walking clear my head. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, maybe even the wind, but deep down I didn't buy it. Something had been moving near the cabin. I just didn't know what. That night, I built the fire higher. I kept it going longer, letting the light reach out as far as it could. I set the lantern in the window again, but left the flashlight next to me on the bed. I lay there fully dressed, boots still on, eyes open and watching the ceiling. Around midnight, the noises came back. They were more confident this time, less hesitant. The steps weren't far off in the woods like the night before. They were right outside. I heard the crunch of leaves near the porch, the faint scuff of something brushing the wall. I froze. My heart thudded so hard I felt it in my neck. I slowly sat up and reached for the flashlight without turning it on. Then I saw it. Through the small window by the door, barely lit by the fire's last orange glow, I saw a figure, just standing there. I couldn't make out the face, or if it even had one. The light was too dim, but the shape was clear. Tall, thin, unmoving, like it had just walked up and stopped. It didn't look like it was holding anything. It didn't move, just stood in that same spot, facing the cabin, maybe 10 feet from the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I just stared at that figure until my eyes started to water. It was there for maybe 30 seconds, maybe longer. Then slowly it turned. Not quickly, just a gradual turn of the body, smooth and steady. Then it walked back toward the trees, one step at a time, like it wasn't in a hurry. Then it was gone, swallowed by the dark. I sat there all night with the flashlight gripped in my hand, pointed at the door. When daylight came, I opened the door and stepped out slowly. The fire had burned down to ash and a few small coals. I walked to where the figure had stood. The leaves were disturbed in a wide patch, just like the one I'd seen the day before on the far side of the clearing. There was no boot print, nothing that would give a clear shape, just more of that strange sweeping pattern. I packed my things fast. I didn't cook breakfast, didn't refill the water jug from the creek. I just threw my gear in the truck and got the hell out of there. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I just drove until I hit the main road and kept going until I saw the gas station on the edge of town. I thought about telling someone, but what would I say? That I saw a figure? That I heard footsteps? No evidence, no injuries, no real crime. Just fear. When I got home, I spent the rest of the day in my apartment, locked in and listening to the city noise. Sirens, car horns, people arguing outside the building. And I was glad for all of it. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. A few weeks later, I started checking forums online. Not for ghosts or monsters. I searched for break-ins near campsites, stalkers, people found living off-grid in national forests. There were stories, some about squatters setting up in old ranger stations, some about escaped inmates using forest trails to move between states. There was even one about a man who had been living in a cave system for nearly a year before hikers stumbled on his camp. No one knew he was there. No one heard him. He just watched and waited. That's what got under my skin most. The idea that it wasn't anything supernatural or bizarre. It was just someone out there, watching, waiting, whoever or whatever I saw that night didn't want to talk. They didn't try to get in. They didn't break anything or make threats. They just came close. Close enough for me to see them. Close enough to know I wasn't alone. I don't go to remote cabins anymore. I still hike. I still love the woods. But I stick to public trails now. Places with other people. Other eyes. I keep a whistle on my pack and carry bear spray, even if I'm not in bear country. Not because of animals, but because of people. People are what scare me now. And when I lie in bed at night, and the wind moves through the alley, and something thumps against the dumpster outside, I think about that figure in the woods. I think about how it moved, how it stood still, and how it waited until I was watching before it walked away. Like it wanted to be seen, like it wanted me to remember. I don't usually talk about that camping trip, not because I think anyone would think I'm lying, but because it was the kind of thing that creeps back into your head at night when everything's quiet. That trip made me second-guess being out in the woods again. Before that weekend, I'd spent more than a decade hiking and camping all over. Small state parks, deep national forests, deserts, mountains, even just quick overnights near rivers. I knew what animals sounded like, what wind sounded like through different types of trees, what certain insects or frogs or even raccoons sounded like at night. But this wasn't any of that. It happened in late September, which is my favorite time to camp. Most people are done for the season, the bugs die off, and the weather gets crisp but not cold. I had some days off, and I didn't tell many people I was heading out. Just my brother and my boss in case anything happened. I packed up the truck and drove about 6 hours north into the woods. Nothing touristy, just an old wilderness area with no marked campsites. The only thing out there was a rough gravel road that ran along the edge of a long ridgeline and a handful of barely used trails that split off into the woods. I planned to hike in a few miles and set up camp away from everything. I started hiking just after lunch. The trail was narrow and looked barely used, but that's what I wanted. A couple of branches had fallen over it and some of the grass in the middle had started to grow up, which told me it had been a while since anyone walked it. I followed it for about 3 miles, then cut off the trail and moved downslope until I found a flat clearing between some tall white pines. There was a small dry creek bed nearby and a moss-covered log that made for a decent sitting spot. I dropped my pack, cleared out some sticks and rocks, and set up the tent. I had no cell signal, which was expected, but I brought a Garmin just in case something went wrong. I wasn't worried. The first night went fine. Cold enough to zip the sleeping bag up, but not so cold that I couldn't sleep. I read a paperback for a while by lantern light, cooked some dehydrated food, and called it a night. I heard an owl off in the distance at one point, and the wind kicked up around midnight, but it wasn't anything unusual. The second day, I hiked around the ridge, staying mostly off trail, just exploring. I like being alone out there. No cars, no people. Just the sound of my boots, the occasional squirrel, and the leaves shifting. I came across a few old hunting stands, but they were rusted and broken down, looked like they hadn't been used in years. Around mid-afternoon, I turned back toward camp. By the time I made it back, the sun was already starting to dip low. I boiled some water, ate, and sat on the log for a while, listening to the forest wind down for the night. It was around then that I first noticed something strange. It was subtle at first. I'd taken out my notebook to jot some thoughts down. I was halfway through a sentence when I paused, not because of anything I saw, but because I thought I'd heard something faint. Not an animal, not the usual forest noise. It was, well, it almost sounded like whispering, like a low hiss with occasional rhythm, like the way people talk in hushed tones when they don't want to be overheard. I looked up and listened. Nothing, just wind and the usual background sounds. I figured maybe it was air moving through some hollow branches. I stood up and walked around the camp a little, scanning the treeline. Everything looked normal. Still, I felt something in my stomach tighten a little. You get instincts when you've camped long enough, little alarm bells that don't go off unless something's truly off. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing what sounded like soft voices in the distance, almost like someone murmuring. I kept sitting up and unzipping the tent, looking around with my flashlight. But every time I did, it stopped. I told myself maybe there were campers nearby I hadn't noticed, even though I hadn't seen any signs of others on the trail. No footprints, no trash, no distant fires. Still, I tried to sleep, figuring I was just being paranoid. But the third night was different. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I didn't like the idea of hiking too far from the area now. Something felt wrong. I tried to enjoy myself, made a small fire using deadfall, sipped coffee from my tin mug, even whittled a little on a stick just to stay busy. I didn't hear anything strange during the day, but as dusk settled in, I began to feel that same tension again, like someone watching me from behind a tree. Started again just after dark. The whispering, louder now. I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't wind. It came from multiple directions, moving slightly from place to place, like something shifting position behind the trees. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my body locked into that kind of stillness you get when you're trying to make sense of whether you're in danger. I didn't make a fire that night. I didn't want to give away my position. I sat in total darkness, using the red beam on my headlamp when I had to, listening for hours. The whispering would stop for long stretches, then start again. It was never loud enough to hear words, and it wasn't a single voice. It was layered, scattered, and always just far enough away that I couldn't tell where exactly it came from. I didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, I packed up camp. Quickly, I didn't even eat breakfast, just stuffed my gear into the pack and got moving. I was supposed to stay another day or two, but I'd had enough. I didn't feel safe out there anymore. Something was wrong with that place. On my hike back to the trailhead, I took a different route, thinking maybe I'd just gotten too deep into my own head. But about halfway through the hike out, I saw something that cemented it for me. I came across another clearing, smaller, maybe 100 feet across, and found signs that someone else had been there recently. But it wasn't a camp. No tent, no fire ring, just strange markings on the ground. Sticks arranged in tight, unnatural patterns, circles and shapes, like someone had been deliberately laying them out in designs. It didn't look like anything ceremonial, nothing artistic, just patterns that didn't make sense. Some were partially covered with leaves, but they were recent. No dust or moss. Something about them felt wrong. I left them untouched and kept going. Faster now. I was sweating even though it was barely 50 degrees out. I had this image in my mind of someone watching me from the trees, tracking me without making a sound. I kept scanning my sides as I walked, hand resting on my belt where my knife was. I'd brought a small hatchet too, and I had it tucked into the back of my pack. I don't usually get that paranoid, but something was different this time. I made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon. The sun was still up, but I could feel my pulse in my ears. I unlocked the truck and threw my pack in, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes just breathing. I didn't report anything. What would I say? I heard whispers and found some weird sticks in the woods. No one would take it seriously, but I've been out dozens of times since then, and I haven't gone back to that area once. A few months later, I did some digging online, just out of curiosity. I looked up that wilderness area, tried to see if others had reported anything strange. I didn't find much, but on an old backpacking forum, I came across a comment buried deep in a thread. Someone talking about camping up along that same ridge 5 or 6 years before. They mentioned the quiet, how empty it felt, and then just one sentence stood out. It got too weird after the second night. Heard whispering in the trees. Never went back. That was it. No replies, no context, but it hit me like a punch to the chest. I stared at it for a long time. Someone else had heard it. Someone else had felt the same thing. I haven't stopped camping, but I stay closer to places with people now. If I go out deep, I bring someone with me, and I trust my gut more than ever. The forest is big, There are things out there you can't explain. And not because they're ghosts or monsters or anything made up. Just people. People you don't see. People who know how to stay quiet. People who live out there. People who don't want to be found. And maybe they whisper so you know they're there, just enough to keep you from coming back. I heard them. I still hear them sometimes in my sleep. But I listened, and I left. And I think that's the only reason I'm still around to tell the story. I camp alone pretty often. It's not that I don't like people. I just like quiet more. There's something about being out in the woods with no phone service, no background noise, no other voices but your own breathing and the wind through the trees. It resets something in me. After a while in the city, I start to feel like my skin doesn't fit right, like I'm full of static. Going out into the woods fixes that, or at least it used to. Last October, I planned a solo camping trip for 4 days. I'd been looking at some backcountry spots in the western part of Montana, not far from the Bitterroot Range. I didn't want a campground with other people around, so I followed a fire road out into the national forest, parked where the road ended, and hiked in about 5 miles. I'd done this sort of thing plenty of times, and I wasn't sloppy about it. I had all the gear I needed: bear spray, a first aid kit, GPS with backup batteries, a compass, and a satellite beacon clipped to my chest strap. The place I picked to set up camp wasn't anything fancy, just a flat spot near a creek, with a thin patch of trees separating me from a broad meadow. You could see where elk had come through and maybe mule deer too. There were old tracks pressed into the mud near the water. I picked a spot near a bend in the creek where the bank was a little higher, with a soft bed of pine needles and not too much undergrowth. Felt right. The first day went fine. I hiked around, gathered some dry wood, filtered water from the creek, and cooked a small dinner over the stove. I didn't make a fire since I wanted to keep a low profile, no reason to attract attention. I ate, cleaned up, and hung my food about 15 feet up in a tree. Then I crawled into the tent and read by headlamp until I was too tired to stay awake. Just another peaceful night in the woods. The second day, I woke up with the light coming through the tent walls and the sound of birds echoing through the trees. I stretched, got dressed, and made some coffee on the stove. The weather was clear but cold. I took a slow walk along the creek after breakfast, following the water for about a mile and back. Nothing strange, just more tracks, lots of squirrels, and a couple blue jays that wouldn't shut up. But when I got back to camp, I noticed something weird. A tree just outside my camp, maybe 30 yards from my tent, was snapped. Not cut, not deadfall. Snapped. About 7 or 8 feet up, the trunk was broken clean, and the top section of the tree was hanging down at an angle, like something had grabbed it and pulled until it split. The wood was still green inside, wet and pale. It hadn't been like that the day before. I stood there for a while, just staring at it. The break was too high for a person, and it wasn't a small tree either, probably 6 inches thick where it had broken. It hadn't splintered from wind. The surrounding trees were untouched, and there hadn't been any storms. I walked around it, looking at the bark. There were marks on one side, deep scratches, but uneven and jagged. Maybe claws. My first thought was a bear. Maybe it had stood up against the tree, leaned into it, and it gave way under the weight. Still, something about it unsettled me. I kept circling it, trying to work out how the break happened. There was no hair, no obvious tracks nearby. The ground around it was covered in needles and soft moss, so anything could have walked through without leaving a sign. I didn't see any scat, no smell, no sounds. But the more I stared at the tree, the more my gut twisted. Something wasn't right about it. Something about how high the break was, how fresh it looked, how quiet the forest seemed. I left the tree alone and went back to camp. I didn't do much for the rest of the day. Mostly sat near the tent, kept the bear spray close, and listened. I tried to shake the unease off. Told myself I was being dramatic. Animals move through the woods all the time. Bears, moose, even the occasional mountain lion. Trees fall, trees break. No big deal. That night, I didn't sleep well. I lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds outside. Around midnight, I heard movement in the trees. Not constant, just a step, then silence. Another step, then nothing. Could have been anything, a deer maybe, but it felt like it was close. Too close. The tent walls were thin, and every sound carried in the cold night air. My body stayed tense for hours. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke again just before dawn. The inside of the tent was damp with condensation. It was still dark, but the sky was starting to lighten. I climbed out of the bag, put on my boots, and stepped outside. That's when I saw the second tree. This one was closer, about 10 feet from the tent. A younger pine, thinner than the first. Snapped in half, same as the other. Fresh. The inside of the wood was white and wet. The broken top lay in the needles nearby. Something had bent it down and forced it to break, again around 7 or 8 feet up. I stood there frozen, scanning the trees, the brush, the creek. I didn't hear anything. No birds yet. No wind. Just that awful silence, heavy and waiting. I packed up camp fast. I didn't cook breakfast. Didn't bother with coffee. I shoved everything into my pack, tore down the tent in minutes, and slung the bear spray into the side pocket where I could grab it easily. I took one last look around the site. The tent spot was flattened. The hanging food bag was untouched. But the second broken tree was too much. Something was coming into camp, breaking trees in the night, getting closer. As I hiked out, I kept checking over my shoulder. Every bend in the trail made me nervous. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. I didn't stop to rest until I was nearly back to the car. I made it out without seeing anything else. No more broken trees, no tracks, no movement, just the long, lonely walk back through the woods. Back at home, I tried to forget about it. I told a friend about the trees, and he guessed it was probably a bear, maybe marking territory. But I'd seen bear signs before. I'd seen claw marks and overturned logs, ripped open stumps, even a fresh bed in the grass once. This didn't feel like that. Felt different. The breaks were too clean, the placement too deliberate. It wasn't just a tree here or there. It was right near my tent. Close. And nothing took the food. Whatever it was, it didn't want a meal. It wanted me to know it was there, that it could come close, quietly, without me ever knowing. It left no tracks, no noise, just those two broken trees. One farther out, one close. Since then, I've gone camping a few more times, but never solo again. I bring a friend now, and we stick to places with more people nearby. I still watch the trees. I still listen at night, long after the fire's gone out. Sometimes I dream about that second tree. The way it was snapped so clean, the way it leaned against the stump like someone had just broken it in their hands. Whatever did that was big, strong, quiet, and it came right up to my tent while I slept. I never saw it, but that's what scares me the most. I was 3 days into a solo camping trip in northern Ontario, somewhere along a quiet stretch of crown land near a small lake I didn't even know the name of. I'd hiked in with my gear and a few basic supplies, set up camp in a little clearing about 30 yards off the water, and was planning to stay out there for about a week. The weather had been good, the bugs were manageable, and I was enjoying the kind of deep, undisturbed silence that only remote forest can offer. That night was the fourth I spent out there. It had cooled down a lot after sundown, so I turned in early, zipped myself up in the sleeping bag, and tried to fall asleep. My food was stored about 10 yards away from the tent, sealed up in a heavy-duty cooler with the lid latched down and a big rock on top. I hadn't seen any bears or anything, but I wasn't being careless. I didn't bring a gun, just bear spray and a knife. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. At first I couldn't figure out why. It was still dark, completely quiet. Then the smell hit me. It was foul, like something rotten. I thought maybe a skunk had passed nearby, but this wasn't that kind of smell. It was sour and thick, like wet garbage and spoiled meat, but stronger, almost like something had been dead for a few days. I sat up inside the tent, unzipped the flap just enough to peek out, and didn't see anything. No movement, no shadows, just pitch black forest. I lay back down and tried to ignore it, but the smell got worse. It was strong enough that I thought something must have crawled under the tent or right beside it. I grabbed my headlamp, turned it on, and reluctantly unzipped the tent all the way. The light caught the thin mist hanging in the air near the forest floor, and I could see my breath. That's when I saw the cooler. The rock I had placed on top of it was gone. The lid was pried open and hanging to the side, one hinge twisted loose. The entire inside of the cooler was gutted. Bits of packaging, shredded plastic bags, and pieces of food were scattered all over the ground around it. Some of it was smeared. One of the packets of cheese I brought was half covered in dirt and what looked like feces. Something had torn through the entire thing like it was paper. A few wrappers were stuck to a nearby tree trunk with a greasy streak that looked like it had been rubbed there with dirty paws. I stood there a long time, scanning the tree line with my headlamp, listening for any noise. The smell was thick in the air. I didn't hear anything except the distant creak of trees moving in the breeze. The longer I looked at the mess, the more it unsettled me. Whatever had come through wasn't just rummaging. It had made a mess out of the entire camp area around the cooler, like it was frenzied or panicked or angry. A lot of the packages were clawed open from the sides, not chewed. Some of the food had been dragged into the brush and left half-eaten. I found a crushed can of soup nearly 20 feet away, still sealed, but bent like something had bitten it or tried to smash it open. There were muddy tracks, too. At first I thought raccoon, which would have made sense, but the size of some of them was off. There were small prints, sure, classic raccoon hand-shaped prints, but I saw a couple bigger ones that didn't match. One looked more like a paw with long claw marks ahead of the pads. It was smeared in the dirt, but too big to be from a raccoon. I crouched down near it with the headlamp, trying to make out the shape, and for a second I actually got chills. It looked like it had dug into the dirt, like whatever made it was leaning into the ground hard when it stepped. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat up in the tent, keeping the headlamp on with the bear spray beside me. I didn't hear anything else, but the smell lingered well into the morning. By sunrise, the scene looked even worse. The entire patch of forest around the food stash looked like a miniature storm had passed through. Broken twigs, trash, ripped up bags, all of it scattered and stomped into the dirt. I spent the better part of 2 hours cleaning it up. I buried the worst of it in a small pit I dug about 100 feet from the camp and used river water and a rag to wipe down everything else that had been smeared or touched. I spent that entire day debating whether to pack up and leave or stick it out. Part of me felt stupid for letting a couple raccoons scare me, but the size of those prints and the violence of the mess, it didn't feel like just raccoons. I thought maybe a bigger animal came in and the raccoons joined the chaos. Maybe a fisher or a wolverine. But I didn't see any definite signs. No fur, no blood, just weird prints and one hell of a mess. The rest of that day passed uneventfully. I made a new fire pit away from the food area, cooked a small meal, and kept my scent down. I tied what was left of the food in a dry sack and hoisted it into a tree. Not ideal, but better than leaving it on the ground again. I also moved the tent a little closer to the lake, figuring it would give me more visibility if anything came through again. That night, I tried to stay awake longer, listening. The forest was quiet again, but I couldn't shake the image of that destroyed cooler and the smell. I left the rainfly half off the tent so I could see out with my headlamp. I didn't hear or see anything. No rustling, no branches cracking. But even without anything happening, I still couldn't sleep. I left the next morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed everything quickly, double-checked the area to make sure I didn't leave trash or anything behind, and made the hike out with my pack full and my nerves frayed. I didn't see another person the entire way back. My legs were burning by the time I got to the car, but I didn't care. I tossed everything in the trunk and drove for nearly 2 hours before I even stopped to breathe. Back home, I told myself it was just raccoons, probably a couple of them, maybe a fox too. Maybe I spooked myself by waking up to the smell and seeing the damage in the dark. Maybe the bigger tracks were just double prints or a trick of the dirt. But I can't shake how it felt. The way everything looked like it had been attacked, not just scavenged. The prints, that stench, thick and oily, like something that rolled in decay. I still go camping, but I don't do solo trips like that anymore. And I never leave my food on the ground again. Even with a bare canister or hung in a tree, I check it constantly, because whatever came through that night, whether it was a group of animals or just one messed up, aggressive creature, it wasn't afraid. It wasn't cautious. It ripped through everything like it wanted me to know it had been there. I never saw it, but that was enough.